Hi there. Today we're going to focus on an introduction to learning and memory. Let's get started. One of the key concepts of learning is through conditioning. And conditioning is one of those concepts that's been established for a long time. Pavlov and a Russian experimenter really came up with the notion of conditioning by conducting experiments with his dog. And the idea was that by connecting a neutral stimulus, a bell, when they ring the bell with the food, then the dog starts to salivate just by ringing of the bell. And so we're going to talk about this in more detail in the next few slides. But first, how do we learn? Well, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior caused by some experience. Oftentimes we learn unintentionally. This is just we learn, our subconscious is picking up different things as we go about our day-to-day activities. And a great example of this is you recognize brands that you don't even use. I can tell you several brands that I don't use, but I recognize them just because I have seen them in different advertisements. I've picked up on them from watching commercials, between television programs. I incidentally picked those up without even thinking. However, we're going to be talking about learning that's more intentional, and there's two different types of learning theories. One is behavioral, and those focus on stimulus-response connections, and the other is cognitive theories, and those focus on consumers as problem solvers who learn when they observe what others say and do. The focus of this particular lesson is going to be on behavioral theories. In a future video, I'll be covering cognitive theories in more detail because it's a lot more complicated than the behavioral theories. So we have two types of behavioral learning theories. One is classical conditioning. This is that involuntary response I had mentioned about Pavlov and the dog. Well, there's also the instrumental or operational conditioning, and that's voluntary behavior. So with operational conditioning, you have reward, punishment, and negative reinforcement, which I'll talk about in more detail. But in this example, a mouse understands that if they push a button, they're going to receive a reward, food, for pushing that button. Now, the same thing with classical conditioning. Whenever the whistle blows or the bell rings, the dog starts thinking about food and starts salivating, whether they get the food or not. So different ways in which this can come about, and we're going to talk about both in detail. So classical conditioning has several components. The Pavlov example, it has an unconditioned stimulus. This was the powder or the food because it was naturally capable of causing the salivation. Over time, the bell became a conditioned stimulus because the dog was conditioned to respond, to salivate, with the ringing of the bell. It didn't initially cause the salivation, but the dog learned to associate the bell with the meat powder or the food. And now the dog salivates at the sound of the bell. So the drooling of the dogs, because of a sound now linked to the food, is the conditioned response. So we have unconditioned stimulus, which is the powder. We have the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, and the salivation or the drooling, which is the conditioned response. So with stimulus or stimuli in classical conditioning, there's stimulus generalization. This is the tendency of stimuli similar to a conditioned stimulus to evoke similar or conditioned responses. So for the Pavlov example, keys jangling instead of a bell, that it would produce a similar response of the dog salivating. We also have what's called stimulus discrimination, and this is when an unconditioned stimulus does not follow a stimulus that is similar to a conditioned stimulus. So some marketing applications of the stimulus and classical conditioning. We could think of this through family branding. So whenever we think of Kraft, maybe you really liked Kraft macaroni and cheese as a kid. Well, now that you see other Kraft products, you may have that same fond affiliation with Kraft. We could also think of this through product line extensions. So maybe you like Tide. Well, marketers are trying to get you to maybe sample or try different other products made by Tide. Tide with Downy, Tide with Gain Scent. Same could be said with Coca-Cola. They came up with a new product, Coca-Cola with coffee. So say you already like Coca-Cola, but you also like getting a coffee in the morning, you might try Coca-Cola with coffee because they're trying to attract you to try Coca-Cola with coffee. The same could be said through licensing. So Monopoly and McDonald's, McDonald's tries to really get those people who like to play Monopoly to come to McDonald's and they can win rewards. And then look-alike packaging. So Head and Shoulders, there's different products that are off-brand that they offer the same or similar benefits, and so they try to look like their alternative. And then finally, with this, through brand equity, a brand is trying to associate these different associations, positive associations in consumers' memory. So the stimuli, all these different stimuli that a brand is trying to put out there, they're trying to bring positive associations in the consumer's mind so that eventually a consumer will purchase a variety of products. Say, for instance, you really like Apple. Well, Apple wants you to buy their iPhone, their iPad, their Mac. They don't want you to just buy one of their products. They want you to buy into all of their products because you have a strong and positive associations with their brand. So with classical conditioning, a key factor is repetition. And the idea is that through repeated exposures, you're going to increase the strength of a stimulus and the response associated with that stimulus. So when exposure decreases, extinction will occur. And the effects of the association will diminish and finally disappear altogether. So if you don't ring that bell, if you discontinue it altogether, then the dog will lose the ability to associate the bell with food and salivation. So some marketing applications of repetition: more exposure to a brand equals increased brand awareness and brand associations. I have a video on this that you can watch in our learning modules. There's also implicit repetition, explicit repetition, and there's several different ads that we'll have on this. Rolaids and Granger, they both repeat their brand name to get you to have repetitively in their commercials to get you to increase those brand associations and brand awareness in your mind as the consumer. However, too much exposure can lead to advertising wear out, so brands oftentimes have to balance the repetition with making sure that they don't wear out consumers from hearing these repeated associations too often. And the idea here is that brands oftentimes they go through certain life cycles that they have to once consumers have been exposed to a brand too much, they have to come up with a new ad campaign, a rebirth. They have to come up with something new to have new associations or to really bring a positive light on their advertising campaigns rather than just the same thing over and over again. Next, we can turn our attention to instrumental or operant conditioning. With operant conditioning, we learn the desired behavior over a period of time through a shaping process. That shaping process involves positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. So with positive reinforcement, we receive a reward. If you remember from previously that I talked about how the mouse pressed the button and they received the food or the piece of cheese, they understood that when they pressed the button, they received a reward. So positive reinforcement was occurring. Negative reinforcement is showing how a negative outcome can be avoided and reinforcing the behavior that avoids that negative outcome. So I will eliminate homework if you study hard and accomplish a lot in class. If you don't, you will still continue to have your homework. Punishment occurs when that unpleasant event follows a response. We learn not to repeat those behaviors. So if the mouse doesn't press the switch, they're not going to get rewarded with the cheese. But if the mouse, say, doesn't press the switch, their punishment might be that they get shocked. So that's their punishment for not pressing the button. And extinction occurs when there's no reinforcement, and that is the conditioning is not activated because it is not reinforced. So reinforcement is necessary for conditioning to be activated. So some marketing applications of operant conditioning. The most obvious one is frequency marketing. And this is where a company or brand rewards regular purchasers with prizes that get better the more that they spend. So if you've ever been a loyalty card holder, this is one of the key ways that marketers and companies condition you is through their loyalty program. One is like frequent flyer program. So if you think of frequent flyer programs, they often have tiers associated with those programs. You can be gold member, platinum, diamond, elite, all those different levels. And so the more that you spend, the better you get, the higher status you get, and the more rewards that you get from that. Gamification. This idea is marketers turn routine actions into experiences by adding a gaming element to tasks that might otherwise be boring. So oftentimes this requires a dynamic digital environment that resembles a video game. It's multiple short and long-term goals, rapid and frequent feedback, a reward for efforts in the form of a badge or virtual product, friendly competition in a low-risk environment. It also has a manageable degree of uncertainty. So all of those elements are present that marketers are considering whenever they offer a gamification aspect to encourage operant conditioning. So the idea with gamification is that there's an endowed progress effect, and that is you load or preload a buyer card with a few punches that make the achievement of the reward appear more attainable. So you give, this would be like an example of a badge or a status just for your first time checking in or just for downloading the app, for example. And then there's also this idea that, okay, through the Starbucks, you have your card, the welcome level, the green level, and the gold level. And so just by joining the opening up the Starbucks rewards aspect, then you're automatically a part of the welcome level. And by spending more and going through that process, you can level up to the green and the gold level. And while marketers could use this to benefit them financially, marketers can also use this to increase the ability to reduce energy consumption. So you get badges. There's some companies like El Paso Electric and they work with Nest, the thermostat, that they provide badges and incentives for people to reduce their energy consumption. And you can also use this to improve employee performance. So it could be an internal marketing tool. That covers us for the behavioral types of learning. So we talked about classical conditioning and operant or instrumental conditioning. If you'd like to learn more about this or any other thing related to learning and memory or consumer behavior, please feel free to email me at kmanus@nmsu.edu. Thanks.